Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, June 15th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, when the rules change, people will change how they work. Plus, agencies are doubling down on AI upskilling, but new research suggests they may be solving the wrong problem. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. At most agencies, probationary employees left their jobs at a higher rate than other federal workers in 2025. That's according to analysis of about 24 agencies in a new report from the Government Accountability Office. Early last year, agencies implemented mass terminations of employees on their probationary period who have limited job protections. For a look at how those separations panned out, Federal News Network's Drew Friedman spoke with GAO's Director of Strategic Issues, Dawn Locke.
We did see some probationary employees who were what I'd say unduly impacted in certain agencies. For example, at the Department of Energy. Now, this is the agency that in part oversees our energy challenges and our nuclear safety. For them, 19% of all agency employees were separated. However, 34% of the probationary staff were let go. And similarly, the Department of Agriculture. So this is the agency that helps us with our nation's food safety and protecting natural resources, amongst other duties. They showed a similar trend with about 30% of all employees separating versus the nearly 42% of probationary staff who were separated.
And just for a little bit of context too, early 2025, can you talk about what actions were taken and why there were such large numbers of probationary separations?
As I think your listeners might know, since early 2025, the administration had directed agencies to reduce their workforces and restrict hiring for most positions. So this did lead to a staffing decline at nearly all major agencies. These executive orders and OPM's accompanying guidance really reshaped the probationary landscape by asking agencies to, for example, identify all probationary employees and determine whether they should be retained. Agencies are also no longer required to factor in probationary employees' performance. And then in addition to that, according to OPM, these probationary employees do not have or do not currently have any rights to appeal. And you know, Drew, what's interesting about this is just 3 months ago, OPM launched an initiative to strengthen the pipeline of early career talent who are entering the federal workforce. But leading up to this, these executive orders and the OPM guidance resulted in the separation of more than 50,000 of these early career individuals. So it's a bit difficult to understand the reasoning behind these actions.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a good point that there has been this sort of swing first kind of to just work towards reductions. Now we're seeing a lot more hiring actions and efforts to onboard people. So it is interesting. Do you have any other either comments on that trend that you're seeing or any other planned research in that area?
So we do plan to continue this work. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a deep dive into specific agencies to really determine the impact and what this all means for meeting their missions. But that work is in its early stages. We have not been able to assess the impact on the outcomes, but what I will say is the ability of federal agencies to fulfill their missions and meet their goals with significantly reduced staff is an open question. So these skills gaps, this is when an agency doesn't have enough people or the right qualified people to achieve its mission, has been on GAO's high-risk list since 2001. And it's hard to imagine that these reductions have not exacerbated the skills gap problem. However, again, without the reduction in force or reorganization plans that these agencies are to have by now, it has not been possible for us to truly determine impacts or what this all means for meeting mission needs, which are ultimately the needs of the American people.
Going back to this report a little bit more specifically, you mentioned some examples where we saw agencies with big gaps between probationary separations and other employee separations, but it also talks about the numbers, so just by scale. So who were some of the biggest or smallest agencies in terms of just the number of separations overall?
Within just this bucket of the health and safety mission agencies, we saw the biggest separations at the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Interior. Both agencies separated more than 30% of their workforce during our time period, whereas agencies like the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Veterans Affairs had the lowest separations at about, I think they both came in at about 10%.
You mentioned a little bit earlier as well some of the regulatory changes that are going on for probationary employees and just how the probationary period operates. Can we start with, before 2025, what did those protections look like for probationary employees?
Prior to the current executive orders and the OPM regulations, like these probationary employees had really 1 to 2 years. It was a training ground. It was kind of the last step of their hiring process. And really those employees were let go if they didn't meet certain performance standards. Now those performance standards have been taken away and really agencies can terminate at will if they're not meeting what they call the mission need.
And then there were also changes as well to the appeals process for probationary employees. What did we see there from OPM and from the Trump administration?
So before, the Merit System Protection Board was responsible for the appeals process, and OPM has since started making changes in that area and will potentially be the entity that takes over for MSPB. But that remains to be seen. That's all in draft right now and has not come to fruition.
And when you had this report come out, did you receive any sort of response from OPM on some of the findings that you had here?
They provided technical comments, which we incorporated, but there was no other response given.
One other piece that I do want to get to as well, you had this really interesting map where it shows where probationary employees separated the most based on the state that they're in. Was there anything that was interesting there in your research and the findings of, just where probationary employees were impacted the most?
Well, I think we fully expected to see that there would be a number of probationary employees separated in Maryland and in DC, where a good chunk of federal agencies were. What we didn't expect to see were the number that were separated, for example, in Maine or Alaska. But again, we don't understand the reasoning behind that or the impact that it's created because we haven't taken that deeper dive yet. So that's what we hope to find out what caused all that when we proceed with this work.
Yeah, and can you talk a little bit more about the upcoming work you have? What are some of the other questions that you're going to be trying to answer about all this?
We're going to be looking at not just the separations, but also some of the hiring that's been done. We're going to look at how contractors have been impacted, if more contractors have been brought in because of the reduction in the workforce. And what we really, ideally, what we'd like to see are the cost savings of all of this, if there have been any, what the costs have been, what the savings have been, and what the impact overall has been to mission.
Dawn Locke is Director of Strategic Issues at the Government Accountability Office, speaking there with Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. You can find Drew's full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, when the rules change, people will change how they work. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The rollout of Schedule Policy Career and a proposed government-wide non-disclosure agreement are putting new pressure on how federal employees think about their jobs. From security and accountability to what they're willing to say out loud, the effects are starting to show up in real ways across agencies. John Hatton of NARF is here to connect the dots for us. John, it's great to have you. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
There have been a couple of really big headlines in the federal workforce. Let's dig into both of them and start with the Schedule Policy Career Executive Order. People have been waiting for this. It finally happened. 8,000 positions moved onto that schedule. When you hear from federal workers who've just been reclassified, what are they telling you? What is this feeling like, or what does it mean?
I think people are worried and anxious and not sure what it means. And we're still not sure exactly what the administration plans to do with this, right? What this does is change your classification so you have less procedural rights to challenge a termination that is not based on merit, that could be based on political affiliation, whatever they claim to say this is about. The fact is, if you are subject to disciplinary action, you have a different procedure for challenging that. There may be an intra-agency process, but that would be controlled by politicals. So the concern is that it could just be a rubber stamp for any action, as opposed to an independent review through the Merit System Protection Board, which is a board with Senate-confirmed appointees with removal for cause protections under current law.
And when you put that together with the changes that OPM has proposed for review in lieu of the Merit Systems Protection Board, what does that tell you about how much leeway folks are really going to have here?
I think it certainly limits the leeway people have. And, the administration tries to claim that this is just about keeping people accountable and carrying out their policies. But these protections are in place to ensure that people are following the law, even if somebody's telling them not to, that people are allowed to report waste and fraud and abuse and corruption, that people are telling the truth to their superiors, even if they may not like what that truth is. So, I think it is not really about accountability. It may be accountability to that person and that political, but it's not necessarily accountability to the American people, to the rule of law, to good governance.
One of the things that this administration also puts with accountability is at-will employment. They can fire you at will. Most of the positions that have been reclassified are GS-15, some GS-14s. Yep. What does moving to an at-will status for these senior folks actually mean?
I think we'll have to see, right? We don't know what the administration intends to do with the individuals reclassified into these positions. The worst case scenario is they want to wholesale fire them and use the lack of real legal protections to prevent that from happening. I think that's maybe unlikely, but the next worst thing is kind of selective terminations of people who are good at doing their jobs, professional, nonpartisan, trying to do their best on behalf of the American people, but that goes against some politically motivated or corrupt purpose that somebody is trying to drive. So the next step down the line is that it is just a greater degree of an axe hanging over somebody's head, and when they're doing their job, a little bit more fear of speaking the truth, a little bit more bending your views to what your boss wants to hear versus what is best for the agency and the mission. So there's different, I think, scenarios of how this happens. There could be variation among agencies, certainly variation depending on who the political appointee is above you. So you may have some perfectly fine political appointees that are doing a good job on behalf of the American people. They're following the policies of the administration, but they're not looking to do anything untoward or try to break the law or push policies outside the bounds of what's legal. So I think we'll have to wait and see if this totally moves forward, kind of how it's implemented by this administration and potentially future administrations.
I realize we're in the realm of conjecture here, but one of the examples you just offered, not wholesale firing of these folks, but a few high-profile removals of people who've maybe offered their best professional opinion in a way that was counter to what the administration hoped. What sort of a chilling effect do you think that would have in the broader workforce?
I think it would have a massive chilling effect. I think you terminate one person, and I think everybody else gets the message, and they then have to make a decision. Do they want to stay with that agency? If they do, are they going to change their behavior in a way that is detrimental to the mission of the American people? And I think that is certainly a concern, and probably one of the most dangerous concerns, because I think this wholesale firing probably gets more political attention, probably gets more pushback. I think the selective firing of people, particularly if they're doing the right thing. Whether that's, for example, the Department of Justice declining to prosecute somebody based on political motives, or prosecuting somebody based on political motives, or declining to. So those types of situations, declining a contract award or grant, or giving one based on political motives outside of objective criteria, I think they're all troubling scenarios that I think we have this merit-based, professional, nonpartisan civil service to provide a degree of objectivity to government operations. And I think that starts to go away with this new policy.
John Hatton is the staff vice president for the National Active and Retired Federal Employees Association. John, on that note, let's turn to the other policy that got a lot of headlines recently, and that is the deployment of a proposed government-wide non-disclosure agreement. It seems like it would apply to everything from internal deliberations to personnel matters. What's your biggest concern there at NARF about how broadly this defines classified information or confidential information?
Yeah, we're concerned about the broadness of the definition of confidentiality and going beyond what typically would have been protected. So what is the purpose of this? I think it goes to a similar concern of chilling speech, chilling action by individuals. So people really worried that even if they reveal what is legally permissible to reveal, if they're highlighting through a whistleblower, waste, fraud, abuse, corruption, are there going to be repercussions and retaliation for that? I think that'll be a concern. I think that's a concern for the American public in terms of right to have information about what the government's doing. There is a line somewhere where things should be internal deliberations and should be confidential, but when you make an extremely broad definition of that confidentiality, it's ill-defined. The federal employees themselves may not know where that line is, and that certainly may chill them from speaking out against actions that they find troubling, that they think the public has a right to know legally, but they're now concerned about the retaliation that would happen if they do speak out.
The administration says that whistleblower protections still apply. You sound like you might not be so sure.
Well, yes, they may still apply, but does this add a new threshold that reduces transparency into government operations that is not really needed for pre-decisional involvement, for deliberations, for a functional purpose of the government? And does it define terms like confidential information so broadly as to go beyond what is legally permissible, or at least have individual federal employees concerned that they can't go beyond or to the threshold of what is legally permissible? So the chilling effect from the broadness of the definition, and I think the fact that it is adding a new restriction that reduces transparency beyond what we have under current law.
NARF has said that current law already restricts this disclosure, that this is not necessary. What is the motivation then, do you think, behind putting this out?
I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not going to look into the motivations of the administration. They have claimed that they want to make sure that pertinent information is not disclosed. And certainly, in certain scenarios, classified information we would agree with, things that would disrupt operations. We understand that motive, but we also think, the public has a right to know, and federal employees faced with the moral quandary of keeping their job or revealing something that's really important for the public to know. Whether this administration or another administration, I think it's critical to have some of those protections. I think there's already a veil covering government operations and difficulty understanding what's going on. And I think there's certainly a balance there between the federal government's need to have confidentiality and pre-decisional involvement in carrying out what they're doing, but also this is not a privately owned company. This is the federal government and is essentially owned by the American people as represented by Congress. So the executive branch does not have an exclusive right to this information.
And when you put these two actions together, less job protections on one hand, tighter limits on what you can say on the other, how are federal employees receiving these two messages together?
Not very well, from what we've been hearing. I think this just compounds upon about a year and a half of different policies that give a lot of fear to federal employees. So it was already shown that this administration has been willing to do mass firings, targeted firings in certain cases of individuals. This just starts to sway the legal balance in terms of how this plays out in court battles, more towards the administration's prerogatives and against those rights that protect a merit-based civil service or disclosure to the American public of information.
I've been speaking with John Hatton. He's Staff Vice President of the National Active and Retired Federal Employees Association. John, I really appreciate you digging into these critical policies a little bit deeper.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, Congress is at a pivot point on reconciliation and the defense bill. But first, agencies are doubling down on AI upskilling. But new research suggests they may be solving the wrong problem. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. There's a growing push to build new skills across government, especially in AI. But if the surrounding systems don't support that learning, the investment may not translate into performance. A new body of research is challenging how agencies think about the problem. And here to share her findings and recommendations is the lead for upskilling in the Administrative Modernization Program at Oregon State University, Dr. Priyanka Dave. Dr. Dave, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Terry.
You are doing some really interesting research on how individuals and organizations think about upskilling. And one of your key findings, it's really sort of counterintuitive, is that individual motivation is not the key here. I think when organizations think about this, though, they're counting on individual motivation. How do we get that so backwards? Why are we wrong?
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked about that because I've been, working with a lot of people, helping them understand a lot of things because of my background. And I would like to make a point here that I did some research a few years back, and we did this amazing survey with 511 people from CIO's exec team. And we found that motivation only is like 7% important for people. What matters the most for them is whether organization is offering them appropriate climate to learn new things. And we have AI this day. So when people or when managers start implementing AI, it's helpful for them to understand that motivation will not help employee adopt AI. They will have to create certain, culture within the organization, provide appropriate climate within the organization so that people can actually start practicing AI. And when I say climate, I'm sure our climate is like a very broad term and it can be anything for any organization. So when I talk about our climate, I'm specifically talking about these 5 things. So first thing first, psychological safety. Employees need to feel safe when they are practicing new things or when they are learning new things. So they should feel safe even if they are making errors. And that also goes with AI implementation or adopting AI. Second thing is opportunity to apply those skills in their daily work. So what organizations can do is offer some opportunities to use those AI related skills in their day-to-day work, because learning sticks when work itself create repetition. So if we don't incorporate what training we are providing in the workflow, employees are never going to practice it. At the same time, third, managerial reinforcement is important. So managers should also, ask the employee how they are using or applying AI tools. They have to recognize those experimentation. They have to, offer them appropriate, safe climate to help them continuously use the AI tool. Peer modeling. Employee learn socially, not just individually. So organizations should also provide some type of support for peer learning. And fifth, and most important, alignment of incentive and systems. Organizations often create, competing signals. So companies say companies may say that innovation matters, but if employees are rewarded only for short-term productivity metrics, experimentation disappears. So it is very important that organizations offer this 5 element when they are implementing or reinforcing their employees to use AI. And all this, is aligned with the organization climate, not just motivation.
That is fascinating and a really useful framework when you think about putting it inside the federal government structure, this massive, nationwide, global even, structure of around about 1.7 million to 2 million employees. There's been very little structural focus on training broadly. So if you were talking to a mid-level manager in an office in Des Moines, for example, what would you tell them about what they can do locally to fit in with this structure?
I'm glad that you asked this question because sometimes I think this is common across industries. And I'm sure you may have seen this. I have seen this in public organization. So maybe you may have seen this in federal workforce as well. Mainly, a lot of time managerial reinforcement is like very weak. And when I say this, I mean, sometimes managers do not follow up after the training. They just treat it as one and done, and they leave it to their employees to see whether learning transfer is happening. Sometimes there are no coaching conversations after the training, and employees receive no feedback about the usage of new tools, and in this case, usage of new AI tools. So when I talk about, government agencies, what we can support our managers with is offering them a good support system. So what we can do is we can encourage managers to ask employees how they are applying new skills, have some conversations around this so that people know that, okay, my manager is going to ask me about how I'm using this tool. So I better experiment with the tool and go back with the real outcomes that I'm achieving. And that's how we are making this effort outcome oriented. At the same time, we can encourage managers to help leaders understand. Leaders are amazing, but sometimes we still have to have that, bottom-up approach in communication. So we can have our managers reinforce this with leadership that recognize the experimentation. It's okay if our employees are making errors. When we are implementing new tool or when we are encouraging our people to adopt AI, we should always make sure we encourage them to do experimentation, and we do not measure productivity at that time because that's the experimentation phase, and productivity won't look great when people are learning or experimenting with the new thing. So in organizations where managers actively coach and reinforce this type of learning application within federal system, skill adoption become operational behavior rather than just temporarily enthusiasm around new systems. So I know a lot of people are like, oh, AI, let me see what it gives me. And then there is no reinforcement. So they just leave it to that without continuously practicing. So I think managers can really play an important role to communicate both upward and downward around usage of AI and creating that reinforcement system.
Dr. Priyanka Dave is the upskilling lead in the Administrative Modernization Program at Oregon State University. Let's take that one step farther. Let's say that there is an agency who really does have a plan and a concept for AI skill development in their workforce. They may buy a training program and try to deploy that. Is that going to work? Is that enough?
I am glad you asked that, Terry. And I think from my perspective, based on my research and experience, I would say I would recommend them to audit barriers before buying content. Most organizations do not have content problem, from my opinion. They have application problem. So what I would recommend is they try to do some check before buying content. So for example, do employees have enough time to practice? Because if we buy content, they will learn, but they won't practice it, then it's not useful. Are managers reinforcing the use of this new tool? Are we changing any workflow around this new training we are buying? So I would recommend them to audit barriers before they buy content. And most importantly, course completion, or let's say training completion, is not transformation. So they should measure behavior change, not just completion of a content or training. So course completion, as I said, is not a transformation. So what they can do, incorporate some metrics. So AI usage in workflows, reduction in, task time, process adoption, how frequently people are using these tools, they can include that. And first thing first, train your managers first, because managers often determine whether this learning that we are offering to people will survive or not. So apart from that, most importantly, create protected time to learn. Organizations succeed when AI often institutionalize learning time rather than expect employees to learn on their own time, because we all have 8 to 5 and there is much we can do within that 8 to 5. So we can't expect our employees to learn outside that 8 to 5. So we have to create some protected time for experimentation. So I would say, if I'm advising any government or federal agency right now, I would say pause before purchasing another AI or any learning platform or content. First, evaluate whether your organization has created the condition necessary for the learning transfer.
I want to work in the organization you're describing, where managers have time and employees have motivation and there's metrics, but we don't all work there. And I want to connect a couple of topics that you've mentioned. One is productivity, not expecting folks to be experts the first couple of rounds with this, and psychological safety. I think what federal employees might fear is that they will be held accountable immediately for productivity, and the environment is very competitive. If I don't use AI, I'm not going to get ahead, so I need to do it, but I don't really have an institutional structure to do it in. So your previous advice was for the manager. Let's give some advice to the employee right now. How should they think about navigating all of this so that they are AI literate and AI proficient, and they also find the space between productivity and psychological safety and performance?
That's a really good question. And I know I'm saying it from my perspective, and a lot of people may not agree to it, but give yourself some grace when you're learning a new tool or new system. Because I know, looking at the current climate, everyone wants to be productive in order to save their jobs. Because this is like, everyone is fearing that AI will take their jobs. And if we don't adopt faster, our skills, whatever we are doing, may become obsolete and AI will take our job. So I would recommend or advise or suggest everyone, please give yourself some grace. You're learning a new tool. It takes time for people to adopt new thing, learn new thing, and then become productive. You cannot expect from people to have one sprint of training and expect them to be a master in certain area. So I would say, take some time, learn new things as you go, and try to experiment with new things. Again, talk to your managers, your supervisors when you are not feeling comfortable, or whether your productivity is measured based on how fast you're working instead of, how efficiently you're working. So try to have honest conversation with your managers, your supervisors. If not, work with your peer. Try to create that support system that can get you through this, AI world that we are creating for ourselves. So I know a lot of people may not agree to this, but I would say, please, please, please give yourself some grace. You are doing your best to keep up with the AI.
I've been speaking with Dr. Priyanka Dave. She is the upskilling lead in the Administrative Modernization Program at Oregon State University. Dr. Dave, thank you so much for sharing your research with us today.
Thank you, Terry. Appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, Congress is at a pivot point on reconciliation and the defense bill. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Questions about the future of another reconciliation package are rippling through Congress, with implications for how and when lawmakers might take up the annual defense policy bill. Mitchell Miller joins me now with the latest from Capitol Hill. Mitchell, great to have you. Thanks for joining me.
Great to be here.
This is the first time in a while that we haven't had to talk about funding for ICE and CBP, but we have plenty of other things to talk about. One of our recurring topics has been FISA, and now the House failed to renew it. They've left for recess, and we have a new D&I nominee.
So this is an issue where, as you know, passing FISA Section 702 was always going to be somewhat difficult, given lawmakers' various views of how it could be implemented, so that it doesn't result on any surveillance picking up Americans overseas. But this has frankly been a big mess that the White House is now trying to clean up. And with the nomination now of Jay Clayton, the federal prosecutor from New York who served as Securities and Exchange Commission chair during the president's first term, President Trump has largely given lawmakers from both parties what they wanted: someone who is not Bill Pulte, who was named acting DNI despite having no intelligence experience. So Clayton's first confirmation hearing has already been scheduled for this Wednesday before the Senate Intelligence Committee. One problem: the current DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, is scheduled to leave office this Friday. So it's unclear if Clayton can get confirmed before she leaves. Probably not. And Democrats have made it very clear they won't vote to confirm Clayton if Pulte is allowed to be acting DNI even for a day. And basically, everyone here on the Hill has the same question. Why did President Trump wait so long to nominate Jay Clayton? Because that would have given him an exit ramp that would have avoided a lot of this conflagration that happened last week, where the House couldn't get the FISA passed, as you mentioned. They even tried a unanimous consent effort in the Senate, and that failed as well. So it seems to be kind of an unforced error on the part of the White House.
Mitchell, even when they have a candidate here for the DNI position that everybody can agree to, they still don't really have agreement on the provisions of FISA that they want to have go forward, do they?
Right. I mean, there's still a lot of disagreement among lawmakers, for example, about how much of the legal aspect do you need in terms of getting a warrant, something to actually specifically say this is who we are going after. And some feel it's been kind of a little bit too loosely used by the FBI and other agencies. So there's still a lot of disagreement related to that. A lot of conservatives, particularly in the House, have said they want more guardrails related to this, that they feel like there's been a potential for spying on Americans. Now, there is one bright spot related to this lapse that occurred on midnight on Friday. Even though there is a lapse and it's technically gone dark, that doesn't mean that wiretaps and surveillance allowed under the law originally that have already been approved by the FISA court, that they're now gone. They are still in place. So anything that had been approved before last week can still go into effect. And as lawmakers point out, FISA is responsible for more than 50% of the intel that gets to the president's desk. So Republican leaders are hoping they can work all of this out very soon. And as many of them mentioned, we have the World Cup underway. We have America 250 events underway. So they really want to get this resolved.
Well, speaking of other unresolved issues, let's talk about Reconciliation 3.0. There are rising voices saying that is a no-go. So what has changed in the conversation over the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, after a lot of talk about this among Republicans throughout the last few months, now there is quite a bit of skepticism that's come about because the ongoing situation with Iran still causing problems there. Keep in mind that the defense budget for the past fiscal year was close to $840 billion. So if you add in reconciliation, which is $350 billion, the overall defense budget would balloon to $1.5 billion. And many lawmakers, even strong supporters of defense, have questions about that, and specifically that $350 billion that would be funding through reconciliation. And it was notable last week that Maine Republican Senator Susan Collins, who leads GOP appropriations, as well as Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell, last week, essentially they said the quiet part out loud. They don't think there can be a reconciliation 3.0. Some still hold out hope. There are some prominent supporters, including House Speaker Mike Johnson and the House Budget Committee Chair Jody Arrington. They and others feel it's important to get some additional items in the reconciliation bill before the midterm elections. They still think that's possible, but I think at this point there are more skeptics than supporters.
Mitchell Miller is Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Well, Mitchell, that discussion then feeds right into the NDAA. The House has a bill that they've sent forward. The Senate has taken up the conversation. How do those two versions compare?
Well, they, at least at the top part of the list, the $1.15 trillion, they're pretty close there, closer than they have been in the past. But there are a lot of provisions that are very different. Among them, the Senate wants to get $750 million for Ukraine. And there are a lot of other issues related to the approval of ships and Navy that are in the Senate version. And the House is still moving ahead with, as you know, in connection with some of the key issues related to contracting and acquisition. They want to move things more quickly. But overall, the thing that really complicates everything the most between these two versions is the war with Iran. And I spoke about that with Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, who is really kind of feeling bad about the fact that he has not voted for the NDAA, which he almost always does. And he explained some of the difficulties in connection with NDAA and reconciliation.
You're talking about $1.15 billion. But it's like you have a door number 2 and a door number 3. The door number 2 is, and there's probably going to be a reconciliation bill, but maybe not. And door number 3 is there's probably going to be an Iran war supplement, but maybe not. The reconciliation bill definitely undermines the appropriators because that bill goes to the Budget Committee, not the Appropriations Committee.
So expanding on that, what Senator Kaine is saying, at least in his view, is that because of this reconciliation, $350 billion being thrown into this, it complicates everything related to appropriations. And frankly, a lot of people feel it's kind of poisoned the overall appropriations process. The appropriators in the Senate generally are pretty collegial, but they've been unable to get to a top-line agreement on the overall budget at this point. And it's just raised some doubts, I think, that have kind of bled down into the committee level related to getting things approved that normally I think would be further along at this point.
On top of that, you have competing war powers votes that indicate that not everybody's on board with the current operations.
Right. You've had a growing number of Republicans joining with Democrats. You had the House approving the war powers resolution on Iran, and the Senate decided to wait until the House acted on that. But now Senator Kaine and others are looking to move ahead with something in the Senate as well. So there's also the issue of the fact that the White House really hasn't formally presented a supplemental on the war with Iran. So that's yet another question mark that lawmakers have as they're sorting out, $1.5 trillion. Where is this supplemental that could be anywhere from $100 billion to $200 billion? Still a lot of questions for lawmakers.
Mitchell, there's clearly some big issues still sitting unresolved on the Hill, but I want to bring you a little closer to ground level and talk about D.C. for a minute. The D.C. mayoral primary is June 16th, and it's sort of a local race, but it really has national implications. You've been talking to folks about what's going on in the mayor's race. What are you hearing?
Well, this is really interesting. If we look at it from the 30,000-foot view, of course, the president has taken a keen issue in, quote unquote, beautifying D.C., taking all these actions that, maybe in the past would have been done by the D.C. delegate or by the mayor, the whole thing with the reflecting pool, the National Guard being brought into D.C., and a variety of other projects, which we don't necessarily have to get into. But nonetheless, the D.C. delegate race this time will be the first time in more than 3 decades that D.C. Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton will not be reelected because she's retiring at the age of 88, the oldest member of the U.S. House, by the way. And I spoke with Julius Hobson, who's an adjunct political professor at George Washington University, about that position. It's a really interesting position, in fact, because it doesn't have a floor vote in the House. Some people think, well, how important can it really be? But as he pointed out, Delegate Norton kind of transformed that position and made it truly a member of Congress, sitting on key committees like oversight and transportation, and in his view, kind of having to play legislative defense, that you can't always just get out there and shout to the rooftops you want to have D.C. statehood. He says that's, of course, obviously always a goal for D.C. But really, he was pointing out that whoever gets elected in this upcoming election in D.C., they are going to have to, even in this highly partisan time, work to get some type of bipartisanship so that they can play this defense with Republicans who strongly want to provide oversight over D.C., as we've seen over the last few years. So he says really this election coming up is probably the most transformative election overall for D.C. since 1974. That goes back to home rule with D.C. just getting implemented, which allowed the district residents to elect their own mayor and D.C. council members. And so it does have a profound impact, these elections, on the overall view of how D.C. is looked at by the rest of the country and what the president decides to do or not do in connection with Washington, D.C. It's, I think, going to be a very fascinating election.
It will certainly be change.
No doubt about it.
Mitchell Miller, Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, thanks as always.
You bet.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Army is warning that an amendment in the House Armed Services Committee's version of the 2026 Defense Policy Bill could discourage technology companies from building data centers on military installations and jeopardize the service's modernization efforts. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis is here with more details. Anastasia, good to see you.
Hi, Terry.
Talk to me about this amendment. I mean, there are many amendments in the NDAA. What's this particular one about?
Yes, so this amendment is part of the HASC chairman's mark. It was introduced by Republican Congressman Corey Mills, and the amendment is titled Restrictions on Data Facility Equipment Placed on Facilities Leased from the Defense Department. So let me give you and the audience a little bit of background. In 2025, President Donald Trump signed an executive order to speed up AI data center development by allowing private companies to use federally owned land to build those data centers on. And the statute in the executive order allows the Pentagon to lease its unused or underutilized land to private companies. The idea is kind of to bring money in by leasing this land, but also military installations would be able to take advantage of the infrastructure these companies are building as the military accelerates its use of AI. The Pentagon said that the companies would be responsible for pretty much everything, for financing, building, operating, maintaining those facilities, and it would be at no cost to taxpayers. So when it comes to this particular amendment, and there were 2 amendments that were introduced, we'll talk about the second one, but when it comes to Mills' amendment, what he basically proposed, and it passed, was the lawmakers want to bar the Defense Department from leasing its land to private companies to build data centers unless these companies agree not to install or operate data facility equipment that contains components manufactured or tied to countries like China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea. And the restrictions would apply to components such as printed circuit boards, advanced semiconductors, chipsets, and other components that the Defense Department deems a national security risk.
So what is the Army's concern with that?
Yeah, so just again, a little bit of background. The Army is currently negotiating with Carlyle Group, and that's one of the world's largest private equity firms, to build this massive data center at Fort Bliss in Texas. And they're also working with CyrusOne, and that's a company jointly owned by KKR and BlackRock, to build another massive center in Utah. They're also planning 2 additional data centers at Fort Bragg in North Carolina and at Fort Hood in Texas. So what the Army is saying here is like, look, the domestic industrial base just doesn't produce some of the components needed for data centers. And this type of restriction creates what they call a federal land penalty that imposes requirements on companies that build facilities on military installations that they wouldn't face building and like elsewhere. They're saying if a company builds outside its gates, they don't face those rules. If they build inside, they do, which means that this will drive companies away along with billions of dollars in investment. And also having this infrastructure on military land gives the military access to some of the computing power. So the Army is saying that if this provision passes and becomes law, the Army would lose access to this power and data infrastructure. And then that would require them to either fund those multi-billion projects with taxpayer dollars or kind of fall behind their adversaries.
Is the Army the only military service that's pursuing this line of construction?
Nope. The Air Force is also considering 5 data centers at different bases across the country.
So have they brought these concerns to their members of Congress?
Yes, they have. They said that they've shared their technical feedback on how this provision will impact them and their leasing authorities. I asked what's the ideal outcome for the Army would be. Would it be the removal of the provision? Would it be changing the language, etc.? The Army basically said that it wants Congress to adopt a policy that secures its systems without hamstringing its partnerships. So they basically said that when a commercial business on federal land provides services to the government, they already fall under strict existing rules. So they just want Congress to incentivize these companies coming in and building their data centers rather than creating barriers for them.
Is the biggest concern just that the domestic supply chain doesn't exist for these, or are there other issues?
This is one of the bigger concerns, but another one, of course, and this is an amendment that Congressman John Garamendi pushed for. It failed to pass, but he was talking about the fact that supply security concerns are not the only concerns when it comes to having data centers on military installations. He says that these data centers, as he puts it, extraordinary consumers of both energy and water, which could impact those installations and strain their resources as they support military operations. So he raised concerns about energy and water consumption, light, noise pollution, encroachment on training operations, and physical and supply chain security. You know, a facility that supports both commercial customers and government users does raise a lot of questions about access controls, about personnel vetting, about, like we discussed, supply chain security, about separation between military and commercial activity. Here's Congressman Garamendi.
What we require in this amendment is transparency. What is the energy issues? What are the water issues as it applies to the base? Is there backup power? Is there light, noise, pollution that would harm the utility of that base? Is there encroachment on training and operations and the physical and supply chain of security? That's it. I'm not saying no. Now, we all know that data centers are a big NIMBY issue in America. Not in my backyard. I'm sure none of us are into that here at this hearing, although I kind of heard some people talk sort of towards that. Fine, don't put them in my backyard, put them over there on the military bases. I don't have a problem with that as long as the military base is not degraded.
Anastasia, what's the next step here?
Of course, this is many rounds of votes away from becoming law. So we'll see what comes out of the Senate Armed Services Committee. We'll see what comes out of the final version of the NDAA. But, there are a lot of questions. After all, this is different from a commercial center to be located outside the gates of the military installations rather than inside a military installation. There are a number of concerns, like we discussed, and the lawmakers and the military will have to contend with those.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Thanks for bringing us this story.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.